On a hot May day in 1990, a luxury car was found engulfed in flames in the Arizona desert, and its owner, a bank fraud investigator named Lee Young, had vanished without a trace. The burning plum-colored Lincoln Town car, discovered 100 miles south of Phoenix, yielded few clues. What it left behind was an enduring mystery that sounds like a movie, complete with missing jewels, cryptic phone calls, and whispers of a Colombian cartel. More than 3 decades later, the disappearance of Leroy Young remains unsolved. Lee Young was a 56-year-old bank executive and fraud investigator living in Scottsdale, Arizona. By all accounts, he was a devoted family man, married to his wife, Connie, and a respected professional. In addition to his banking career, Lee had a side passion as a jeweler. He often bought and sold jewelry in his spare time, and was known to carry plenty of cash for those deals. He even wore a distinctive copper-faced Rolex watch encrusted with diamonds, a personal trademark that would later become a key detail in his case. As a fraud investigator, Lee's job was to delve into financial irregularities. In early 1990, he was working on a sensitive case. He suspected that his Scottsdale bank was being used by criminals to launder money, potentially involving a Colombian cartel. Lee had reached out to federal authorities about these suspicions, determined to uncover the truth behind the illicit funds flowing through the bank. On May 4th, 1990, Lee Young went about his day as usual until lunchtime, when he met with a colleague at Coco's restaurant on North Scottsdale Road. He was last seen leaving the restaurant around 12:30 p.m., presumably heading back to work or to run errands. However, Lee never returned home that evening. At some point that afternoon, something mysterious happened, and Lee was never seen again. That day, after 3 p.m., a series of phone calls were made from Lee's car phone under puzzling circumstances. Records show that 1 incoming call was received, and 3 outgoing calls were dialed from the car phone later that afternoon. One of the numbers called was a payphone, and 2 others were to a woman who, when contacted, insisted she had never spoken with Lee that day. This raised the alarming possibility that these calls were made by someone other than Lee. Detectives noted that it's entirely possible Lee was already in danger by early afternoon, and that any calls made after about 2 p.m. might have been placed by the perpetrator. In other words, the very person responsible for Lee's disappearance could have been using his car phone, possibly to misdirect investigators. Friends and family grew concerned when Lee didn't come home on May 4th, and by the next morning, their worst fears were realized. On May 5th, 1990, the day after Lee disappeared, a deputy sheriff in Pinal County came upon a shocking sight in the remote desert near Oracle, Arizona. It was a Lincoln Town car blazing on the side of a dirt road. By the time authorities extinguished the flames, the car was burned to its frame. It was soon identified as Lee Young's car, though there was no sign of Lee himself at the scene. Due to the extensive fire damage, any potential forensic evidence was completely destroyed. The location of the burning car, about 100 miles south of Phoenix in a sparsely traveled area, deepened the mystery. When investigators combed through the wreckage of Lee's 1989 town car, they made a perplexing discovery. In the trunk of the car, remarkably intact despite the fire, they found a cache of jewelry valued at several $1,000s. This was inventory that Lee likely carried for his side business in jewelry trading. Notably, however, a couple of critical items were missing. Lee's cherished Rolex watch, the one he always wore, was gone, and so was his briefcase full of work documents. This briefcase was believed to contain files and notes from his bank fraud investigations. The car's passenger compartment was too badly burned to yield much else, but the absence of the briefcase and watch spoke volumes. These missing items would soon steer the investigation toward possible motives. The cops initially wanted to write the whole thing off as a robbery gone wrong, but Lee's family pushed back hard against this narrative. Connie Young, Lee's wife, was adamant that a random robbery didn't seem to fit the facts. She pointed out that aside from Lee's personal Rolex, none of the other jewelry or valuables were taken from the car's trunk. The one thing taken from the trunk wasn't cash or gems, but Lee's briefcase of investigative files, an item of importance to Lee's work rather than his personal wealth. This clue was a glaring one. It suggested that whoever was responsible might have been far more interested in what Lee was working on than in what he was carrying. Investigators treated Lee Young's case as a likely foul play situation from the start. There was no evidence that Lee left on his own accord. His bank accounts were untouched, and he had no known reason to disappear voluntarily. The condition and location of the car strongly hinted at criminal involvement, and Scottsdale police officially classified Lee's case as a suspected slaying. With the physical evidence scarce, detectives had to rely on circumstantial clues and Lee's background to hypothesize what happened. Two primary theories emerged and would come to dominate discussions of the case. One initial theory was that Lee Young fell victim to a robbery that spiraled out of control. It wasn't hard to see why this idea surfaced. Lee's lifestyle could make him a target for thieves. He was a well-dressed businessman, often seen wearing an expensive Rolex, and it was well known that he carried large amounts of cash to facilitate on-the-spot jewelry purchases. To an opportunistic criminal, Lee might have seemed like someone carrying a small fortune on any given day. The scenario imagined by this theory is that perhaps, after Lee left the restaurant on May 4th, someone approached him and then robbed him. In this line of thinking, the criminal might have forced Lee to drive out to the desert, taken his valuables, and disposed of his body somewhere in the vast Sonoran desert. However, as investigators dug deeper, the robbery theory started to falter. The crime scene didn't fit the pattern of a typical robbery. The presence of all that jewelry left untouched strongly suggested that theft wasn't the primary motive. It's possible the perpetrator overlooked the jewelry or couldn't find it in the dark trunk, but that seems unlikely given how much wealth was left behind in the open. Additionally, while Lee's fancy Rolex was missing, consistent with a robbery motive, it could also have been removed for other reasons. For instance, it could have been removed to make it look like a robbery, or a hitman could have gotten greedy. The second, far more sinister theory is that Lee Young was targeted because of his investigation into a money laundering operation. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Lee had been zeroing in on irregular transactions at the bank where he worked. He suspected that large amounts of illicit money were being funneled through accounts there, cleaned to appear legitimate, a classic money laundering scheme. Lee's inquiries had pointed toward a Colombian cartel as the source of these funds. He was sufficiently concerned that he alerted federal law enforcement agents who specialized in smuggling and money laundering. He was essentially blowing the whistle on what he believed was a dangerous conspiracy. Federal agents did take his information and were looking into the case. In fact, Lee remained in contact with those agents. About a week before he vanished, he tried to reach out to them again, but was unable to get in touch. This suggests that something he discovered might have alarmed him enough to urgently seek help, or perhaps he sensed he was in danger. Those who support the cartel theory believe that Lee's investigation hit a nerve with very dangerous people. If a cartel was indeed laundering millions through an Arizona bank, an internal investigator like Lee Young would pose a serious threat to their operation. Eliminating him and destroying his evidence could have been seen as the only way to protect their lucrative enterprise. Under this theory, what happened on May 4th, 1990, wasn't a random crime at all, but a planned hit. Lee could have been lured into a meeting under false pretenses, perhaps someone pretending to be a source or client. and then abducted him to silence him. The fact that Lee's briefcase of files disappeared aligns with this scenario. The perpetrators might have seized his documents to find out how much he knew, or to erase the proof of their activities in a pre-digital world. One angle amateur sleuths have speculated on is whether Lee's greatest danger didn't come from outside the bank, but from within. And personally, I prefer this theory, even though I have to admit it's based entirely on circumstantial evidence. As an internal fraud investigator, Lee was probing sensitive transactions and asking questions about accounts that may have been used to funnel cartel money. If he was closing in on proof, it's plausible that someone inside the institution, perhaps a colleague with divided loyalties, saw him as a threat. Banks were not and are not immune to infiltration by bad actors, and organized crime groups often seek insiders who can work with them on their schemes. If such a person existed at Lee's bank, their priority would have been to keep the money flowing and the operation undiscovered. Lee's persistence could have forced their hand. The missing briefcase becomes even more suspicious in this context, since an insider would know exactly what kind of information he carried and why it was dangerous. Rather than a faceless cartel operative striking at random, Lee may have been undone by someone he worked alongside every day. Under this theory, an insider who provided access, arranged the ambush, and ensured his files never reached federal investigators. Further yet, this insider would have been able to use the documents which Lee carried to cross-reference with documentation in the bank as well. Of course, the most sinister theory of all is that the feds were compromised and tipped the cartel off to Lee Young's investigation. I see this as a less likely possibility given that federal agencies are much more difficult to infiltrate than a fairly small bank in Arizona. That said, it's not something that can be dismissed entirely. In the 35 years since Lee Young vanished, his family and friends have had to live without answers. Lee Young's disappearance has continued to remain a chilling Arizona unsolved mystery. Hey everyone, Jimmy here with a reminder to like and subscribe, share the video, and check out the Patreon. Also, don't forget to check out the podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, which includes some of the content on here, as well as bonus content you won't hear anywhere else. Search it up wherever you get your podcasts, or click one of the links in the description. It began not with a bang, but with a void. On the morning of Tuesday, August 22, 1911, a French painter named Louis Béroux walked into the Louvre's Salon Carré to set up his easel. He planned to sketch Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of Lisa del Giocondo, a respected Renaissance work known to the French as La Joconde. But where the painting should have been, there was only a blank space on the wall, marked by 4 iron hooks. The artist wasn't immediately alarmed. Museum staff often removed artworks for photography or cleaning. He asked a guard to check, but hours passed with no sign of the painting. It wasn't until late that afternoon, more than 24 hours after the fact, that the museum staff finally accepted the unthinkable. The painting known better to the world as the Mona Lisa was gone. Before this moment, the painting was a masterpiece, but it wasn't a global icon like it is today. It was the brazen theft and the empty space it left behind that would launch it into the stratosphere of fame. The crime itself was shockingly simple, a testament to the Louvre's laughably poor security in the early 20th century. The thief was Vincenzo Perugia, a 29-year-old Italian handyman who had previously worked at the museum. Ironically, his job had been to help build the very protective glass cases meant to safeguard the Louvre's treasures, including the Mona Lisa herself. This inside knowledge gave him a crucial advantage, and on Sunday, August 20th, he hid overnight in a storage closet, as was the style at the time. The next morning, a Monday when the museum was closed for maintenance, he emerged wearing a work outfit, blending in perfectly with the other staff. He walked into the deserted gallery, lifted the painting from its hooks, and carried it to a service stairwell. There, he removed the panel from its heavy frame and glass, leaving them behind. Tucking the masterpiece into his work clothes, he made for an exit, only to find the door locked. In a twist of fate, a passing plumber saw his struggle, and assuming he was a trapped co-worker, unlocked the door for him, allowing Perugia to walk out into the streets of Paris. Once the news broke, it created a media firestorm unlike any seen before for a work of art. The Mona Lisa's face was suddenly on the front page of newspapers around the world. The French borders were secured, and checkpoints were set up across the nation. Both public and private rewards were offered for the Mona Lisa's safe return. The theft became a national scandal, and the public became obsessed. When the Louvre reopened a week later, a strange phenomenon occurred. More people lined up to stare at the empty space on the wall than had ever visited to see the painting itself. They left flowers and notes, turning the void into a shrine for their missing icon. The police investigation, meanwhile, was a sprawling mess. They found a single thumbprint on the discarded frame but couldn't match it to anyone in their files. The case took a bizarre detour when suspicion fell on the avant-garde artist Pablo Picasso and the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. Needless to say, they weren't the criminals responsible for this heist, but the authorities tried their hardest to make the facts fit their bizarre theory of the case. Little did the authorities know, the Mona Lisa was essentially right under their noses. For 2 years, the painting remained hidden in a false-bottom trunk in Perugia's modest Paris apartment, just a few miles from the Louvre. The historical consensus on his motivation is complex. During his trial, Perugia presented himself as a patriot, claiming he stole the painting to return it to its rightful homeland. He believed, incorrectly, that it was one of the many artworks looted from Italy by Napoleon Bonaparte. In reality, Leonardo da Vinci had brought the painting to France himself and sold it to King Francis I centuries earlier. While Perugia may have harbored genuine nationalistic feelings, evidence strongly suggests a financial motive was at play. Letters to his family spoke of making his fortune, and his first move wasn't to gift the painting to the Italian state, but a crude attempt to ransom it back to Italy. Patriotism, it seems, was a convenient and highly effective defense, but profit was the likely goal. The end came in December 1913, when Perugia, using the alias Leonardo Vincenzo, wrote to an art dealer in Florence named Alfredo Geri, offering to sell him the Mona Lisa. And yeah, you don't have to rewind to hear that again. His alias was Leonardo Vincenzo. Geri, intrigued but suspicious, contacted Giovanni Poggi, the director of the Uffizi Gallery. They arranged a meeting at Perugia's hotel. There, the thief dramatically revealed the painting, pulling it from the secret compartment of his trunk. The two men authenticated the masterpiece by its brushwork and the Louvre's seal on the back, and then did something to one-up the audacity of the thief himself. Pretending they needed to finalize the purchase at the gallery, they took the painting for safekeeping and immediately called the police. At this point, it's probably pretty clear that Perugia wasn't the master thief he thought he was, and he was arrested soon after. The recovery was as sensational as the theft. Perugia was tried in Italy, where the public largely hailed him as a national hero due to his claim about having done it all for the glory of Italy and Italians. The Italian court was sympathetic, and he was given a lenient sentence of just over a year, ultimately serving only about 7 months in prison. Legend has it he received extreme preferential treatment from prison guards and the state, many of whom did see him as a legitimate Italian patriot. Before its return to France, the Mona Lisa went on a triumphal tour of Italy, exhibited in Florence, Rome, and Milan to massive, adoring crowds. When she finally returned to the Louvre in January 1914, more than 100,000 people came to welcome her home in the first 2 days. The theft had done what centuries on a palace wall could not. It had transformed a Renaissance masterpiece into a global icon. The world had learned the Mona Lisa's name, not just by seeing her enigmatic smile, but by feeling the profound shock of her absence. The true motivation for Perugia's theft remains mysterious, since there's no way he could have possibly been able to unload the art. That said, it looks as though his patriotism defense was an afterthought. All evidence seems to suggest that he saw the opportunity to swipe a valuable piece of artwork. However, it's important to remember that while he was stealing priceless art, the Mona Lisa he stole wasn't the mythologized painting of today. Without the theft by Perugia, it's unlikely that the Mona Lisa would have gone on to become the most famous piece of fine art in human history. And so, with that, it's interesting to consider that Perugia may have actually acted in a more patriotic way than he could have ever realized. After all, without his quote-unquote intervention, it's possible that we would be living in a world where Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Necklace is the equivalent of our Mona Lisa. Imagine a moonless midnight on a lonely dirt crossroads in rural Mississippi. A young bluesman stands at the barren intersection, guitar in hand, desperate for a way to become great. According to legend, Robert Johnson was that man, and on this eerie night, a tall, mysterious figure approached out of the darkness. The stranger, said to be Satan himself, silently took Johnson's guitar, tuned the strings, and played a few haunting chords before handing it back. In that fateful moment, the story goes, Robert Johnson struck a deal with the devil, exchanging his very soul for otherworldly musical talent. When the phantom vanished into the night, Johnson was left standing at the crossroads with mastery of the blues, and a curse that meant his soul now belonged to the devil. It's a chilling tale that sounds like pure folklore, yet it has become one of the most enduring mysteries in American music history. How did this humble Mississippi musician come to be at the center of a supposed Faustian pact? And what truth lies behind the legend of the bluesman who bargained with the devil? To understand that, we must first meet Robert Johnson himself, the man behind the myth. Robert Johnson was no ordinary musician, at least not in retrospect. Born in 1911 in Hazelhurst, Mississippi, he lived in the heart of the Delta, the cradle of blues music. Johnson's early life was marked by hardship and restlessness. He was a small, slight young man with a hunger to make music, known initially for playing harmonica as a boy. However, his dream was to become a great blues guitarist and singer. In the late 1920s, Johnson hung around older bluesmen trying to hone his guitar skills. By all accounts, he wasn't very good at it, and the legendary bluesman, Sunhouse, later remembered the young Robert Johnson as a, quote, embarrassingly bad guitarist. This lack of early talent makes what happened next in Johnson's life all the more perplexing and perhaps ripe for legend. Around 1930, Johnson vanished from the blues circuit, and most people thought this hopeless young man gave up on his improbable dream. Then something very weird happened, which set the stage for the legend surrounding him. About a year later, when Johnson finally reappeared in the Delta, he was transformed. Seemingly overnight, he had become an absolute virtuoso on the guitar, able to outplay even the master guitarists who had once dismissed him. Fellow bluesman Johnny Shines recalled that Johnson could pick up any song after hearing it just once, whether blues, gospel, or more mainstream tunes. This was both strange and oddly disturbing, given Johnson's previously questionable abilities. Robert Johnson developed a complex, innovative style and a soulful singing voice that captivated those who heard him. It was as if Robert Johnson had unlocked a superhuman level of skill in a shockingly short time. Johnson spent the next several years, from 1932 to 1938, roaming the Delta and beyond as an itinerant musician. He played on street corners, and at country dances, and at rundown drinking establishments, and often just worked for a few dollars or a meal and a place to sleep. He was a rambling presence, known to hop trains or hitch rides, and he often used different names in different towns, adding to the aura surrounding him. In an era of segregation and hardship, the life of a young black bluesman was tough and often dangerous. But Johnson was committed to his music above all else. Shamanism is He finally got the chance to record in 1936 and 1937, cutting 29 songs in 2 sessions in Texas. These recordings, including future classics like Crossroad Blues and Sweet Home Chicago, showcased his eerie, expressive vocals and astonishing guitar technique. Yet during his lifetime, those records made only a minor ripple regionally. Johnson remained virtually unknown to the wider world and earned no fame or fortune to speak of while alive. In August 1938, at just 27 years old, Robert Johnson met an untimely and mysterious end. The most accepted story is that he was poisoned with strychnine by a jealous husband or bar owner, after Johnson reportedly flirted with the man's wife during a gig. Another version of events suggests that he was poisoned with dissolved mothballs. Still others suggest that his cause of death was perhaps something more occult-related. Whatever the case, what is known is that Johnson fell ill for days and died in painful convulsions near Greenwood, Mississippi. Unfortunately, his death certificate doesn't provide further insight into his cause of death, though one researcher was allegedly able to get a confession out of the poisoner. However, this confession was obtained on the condition that the researcher never publish the man's name. In the end, Johnson was buried in an unmarked grave, his passing barely noticed at the time. That could have been the end of what was, until then, his obscure story. But in death, Robert Johnson's music found new life. Long after he was gone, his records were rediscovered and hailed as masterpieces, influencing icons like Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, and Bob Dylan. By the 1960s, despite being unknown in life, Johnson was being hailed as the king of the Delta blues and was a near-mythic figure of American music lore. Central to that growing legend was the tale of the deal with the devil at the crossroads, a story that tried to explain how Robert Johnson became so extraordinary seemingly overnight. The legend of Robert Johnson's satanic deal is the stuff of pure Americana, a dark fable repeated and embellished for decades. In the popular version of the story, young Johnson's burning desire to be the greatest blues guitarist led him to a midnight rendezvous at a crossroads. Some say it was the junction of Highways 61 and 49 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is today marked by a trio of hanging guitars on a pole. Other locations have also been suggested, and while the exact location varies, the core myth is the same. Robert Johnson waited by the crossroads on a moonless night, guitar in hand, until the devil showed up to answer his prayer. In that moment, Robert Johnson's soul was sealed in a devilish bargain. In exchange, he was granted otherworldly mastery of the guitar, the ability to summon haunting melodies and soul-piercing blues whenever he played. The legend pointedly parallels the story of Faust, the man who sold his soul for knowledge and power. Here, the currency was the blues. Johnson walked away from the crossroads with the devil's tuning and a pact signed in blood, destined to become the unrivaled king of Delta blues. The cost of this varies in the telling, but every version accepts that eternal damnation is part of the deal, while other versions add that he would only ever achieve fame in death. It's easy to see why such a sensational story caught on. Johnson's rapid transformation from mediocre guitarist to virtuoso seemed almost supernatural to those who knew him. The Mississippi Delta in the 1930s was steeped in spirituality and superstition. People spoke in whispers about hoodoo magic, spirits, demonic pacts, and deals struck under midnight moons. The blues itself was often condemned by church-going people as the devil's music, sinful by nature. In Johnson's case, he literally sang about demons and hellhounds, which only added fuel to the fire. Songs like Me and the Devil Blues paint a portrait of waking up to Satan knocking on his door, and Hellhound on My Trail speaks of being chased by demonic dogs. It wasn't hard for listeners to connect these lyrics to the legend, and in his most famous track, Crossroad Blues, Johnson moans about going down to the crossroads and kneeling to beg for God's mercy. This is a haunting scene that many later interpreted as a reference to his midnight meeting with Satan. Under this interpretation, the song is based on Johnson going back to the same place where he made the deal with the devil to plead with God for his soul back. Whether Robert Johnson factually attempted to make a pact with the devil actually yields an answer that's much more unusual than you would expect. This answer also provides significant insight into the chilling aura that this bluesman cultivated in his own lifetime. While the Crossroads legend makes for a spooky origin story, researchers and those who knew Johnson have offered far more earthly explanations for his musical metamorphosis. For one, that year or two when Johnson disappeared from the music scene wasn't spent summoning demons, but dedicated to intense practice. But here's the thing. The practice Robert Johnson underwent was quite bizarre, and reads like something out of the origin story of a character from a horror flick. Johnson sought out a mentor, an older bluesman named Ike Zimmerman, who was renowned for his guitar skill. As it happens, Zimmerman had an unusual teaching method. He and Johnson would sit in quiet graveyards around the midnight hour to practice guitar, believing it was a peaceful place where no one would disturb them. But it gets a bit weirder, since Zimmerman himself claimed that he received his musical abilities not by conventional means, but by communing with the dead in cemeteries. Some have interpreted this unusual method of practicing guitar as being an occult ritual, and as providing some verification for the legend surrounding Johnson. Another key to the puzzle lies in a little bit of folklore crossover that happened due to another contemporary blues musician with a similar name making some sensational claims. It turns out the story of a blues player selling his soul at a crossroads didn't originally belong to Robert Johnson at all. A contemporary Delta bluesman named Tommy Johnson had been openly bragging about a similar devilish deal years earlier. Tommy Johnson, who wasn't related to Robert, would tell people he sold his soul to the devil to explain his own guitar prowess. When blues scholars and enthusiasts in the 1960s started digging up Robert Johnson's story, it appears that Tommy's devil deal legend got mashed together with Robert's life. The likely truth is that Robert Johnson's immense talent and Tommy Johnson's colorful myth were fused into one compelling narrative, and thus the ultimate blues legend was born. This legend was of course bolstered by the fact that those closest to Robert Johnson knew that he practiced guitar at midnight in graveyards, an act that was disturbing to religious Southerners. In an interview decades later, Son House, that elder bluesman who knew Robert as a youth, was asked about the Crossroads myth. He said that if he hadn't seen Robert's improvement with his own eyes, he would say that he must have sold his soul to the devil. This interview was taken out of context and sensationalized. House was simply stating that if he hadn't seen it happen himself, the only way he could explain it would be some sort of occult intervention. But he had seen it himself, so it was clear the devil wasn't involved. Further, long after Robert died, his family stated that he had sold his soul in interviews decades later. However, in the context they're talking about, it's clear they don't mean a literal pact with the devil. What they're talking about is Robert Johnson's decision to become a bluesman rather than to play gospel music. Real or not, the tale of Robert Johnson's deal with the devil has proven irresistibly compelling, ensuring that his name lives on in popular culture. In the decades after his passing, as his music reached new audiences, the Crossroads story went viral along with his music. Johnson's posthumous fame itself added credibility to the myth. Here was a man who died penniless and unknown, yet by the 1960s he was being lauded as the greatest Delta bluesman ever, with record sales climbing worldwide. To the superstitious, it almost felt as if Robert Johnson got his true reward only after death. It was a warm February afternoon in 1988 in Honolulu, and 12-year-old Ji Zhao Lee was doing something every kid her age might do. She was going door to door selling fundraiser tickets in her neighborhood. The streets around Nuuanu Avenue felt safe in those days, a time when many in Hawaii believed their idyllic community was immune to horrors like child abduction. Yet by nightfall, that ordinary after-school activity had turned into every parent's nightmare. Ji never came home that evening, and the mystery of what happened to her has haunted the islands ever since. Ji Zhao Lee was a bright, hard-working girl who had moved to Hawaii with her family just a couple of years before her disappearance. Born in China in the mid-1970s, she was the middle of 3 daughters. Her parents had kept her and her younger sister hidden in China due to the one-child policy until they could move the family to Honolulu for a better life and a taste of freedom. Once in Hawaii, she adjusted well at Royal Elementary School. By early 1988, she was eagerly helping with a school fundraiser to raise money for a class trip to the Big Island. On February 11, 1988, Ji set out after school with a stack of raffle tickets to sell for the fundraiser. She left her family's apartment with her ticket book in hand and promised to be home by 6, as her mother had instructed. Her mother even gave her a wristwatch to keep track of time, and she vowed not to be late. With that, the 12-year-old headed out to make as many sales as she could for her class. Bystanders later recalled seeing Ji Zhao outside a 7-Eleven store on Nuuanu Avenue and Kwakini Street around 4:45, politely asking people if they would buy a ticket. At some point, witnesses reported that a girl matching Ji's description may have gotten into a light-colored 1950s Chevrolet sedan. This distinctive detail stood out, and police treated it as a critical clue. A classic car like that was uncommon, and it was the only lead they had into who might have encountered the 12-year-old that day. By 6 o'clock, when Ji still hadn't come home, her mother grew alarmed. The Lee family began frantically searching the area, calling out her name and knocking on neighbors' doors, but found no sign of her. Finally, early the next morning, they filed a missing person report with the Honolulu police. Police launched an intensive search, and the community rallied to help. About 2,000 volunteers joined officers in combing the surrounding neighborhoods for any trace of the missing girl. Teams scoured streets, yards, and even streams, while helicopters flew overhead and divers checked nearby waters. In all, tens of thousands of man-hours were devoted to the search over the following weeks. Despite this massive effort, no physical evidence of the missing girl would ever be recovered. Investigators focused on the tip about the 1950s Chevy and painstakingly tracked down every similar car on Oahu. They interviewed each owner, hoping for a break in the case, but unfortunately, that lead went nowhere. A composite sketch of an unknown man seen near the 7-Eleven was released to the public, but he was never identified. With no witnesses and no evidence beyond the initial sighting, the investigation hit a heartbreaking dead end. As months passed with no answers, the case went cold. Authorities came to believe that G had most likely been abducted by a stranger and met with foul play. For the Lee family, life would never be the same, and her father spent years walking the streets, asking anyone who would listen if they saw anything that day. Her mother kept their phone number unchanged and would sit by the phone each night, holding on to hope that one day G might call. Over the years, police fielded many tips and possible sightings, but none ever led to any breakthroughs. The leading theory is that a predator seized the opportunity to kidnap her in broad daylight. With no evidence or suspects identified, investigators suspect she was likely slain soon after being taken. Another equally disturbing possibility is that she was abducted as part of a trafficking operation and then eliminated as she grew older. However, no evidence exists to support this theory, and it remains pure speculation. Despite the passage of time, her family continues to hold out hope that she remains alive. Transcendental meditation is a mental technique that's gained global attention for its purported ability to relieve stress, promote relaxation, and enhance overall well-being. Transcendental meditation's popularity exploded in the 1960s and 1970s, largely because of famous practitioners such as the Beatles, who studied under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The Maharishi was born in India and studied under Gurudev Swami Saraswati before developing a streamlined approach to meditation that would appeal to a global audience. He believed that mental transformation could translate into societal and even global change, leading him to found the International Meditation Society in 1957. By the 1970s, transcendental meditation was being taught to hundreds of thousands of people across the United States, Europe, and other continents. Central to Maharishi's vision was the idea that one could access a fourth state of consciousness beyond waking, dreaming, and deep sleep by using a personalized mantra. He argued that this mantra would help the mind settle into a state of profound restfulness and heightened alertness. Although this approach has roots in ancient Indian spiritual practices, the form presented by Maharishi was adapted for modern lifestyles, emphasizing ease of practice and broad accessibility. The main concept behind TM is that the mind naturally seeks fulfillment or happiness. Proponents believe that, left to its own devices, the mind will gravitate toward deeper, more harmonious levels of awareness if given the chance. Transcendental meditation provides that chance by using a mantra, often a Sanskrit sound given by a certified teacher, which serves as a mental vehicle. During a session, the practitioner silently repeats the mantra, and if thoughts arise, they're not resisted, but gently acknowledged and replaced with the mantra. Another key principle is that meditation should feel effortless. Unlike other forms of meditation that might involve focused attention or specific breathing patterns, TM aims for a state where the mind freely transcends mental activity. This is thought to allow for effortlessly dipping into quieter layers of consciousness. Proponents argue that when the mind is allowed to settle in this manner, it naturally experiences what's described as pure awareness, or a deep sense of calm. A third principle emphasizes consistency. Practitioners typically meditate twice a day for about 20 minutes, once in the morning and once in the late afternoon or early evening. Adhering to this schedule is said to maximize the benefits, especially the long-term accumulation of inner tranquility and stress reduction. During these sessions, practitioners sit upright in a comfortable position with eyes closed, minimizing distractions. It's also important to note that TM does not require any specific religious or philosophical belief. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi stressed that people from any background, or none at all, could benefit from the technique. According to practitioners, many individuals practice TM for purely health or psychological reasons, rather than spiritual ones. The Greater Key of Solomon is one of the most well-known grimoires in Western occult tradition. Despite its association with King Solomon, scholars generally agree that it originated in the 14th or 15th century during the Italian Renaissance. This text reflects the era's fascination with esotericism and ceremonial magic, blending Christian, Jewish, and pre-Christian Greco-Roman influences. The grimoire is divided into two primary books. The first focuses on summoning and commanding spirits, offering instructions on invocations, prayers, and rituals. These rituals are elaborate and require significant preparation, including purification processes for the practitioner. Practitioners are directed to maintain physical and spiritual purity, emphasizing the importance of discipline and focus in working with spiritual entities. The second book details the construction and use of magical tools such as pentacles, swords, and wands. It explains the materials and techniques for crafting these objects and stresses the importance of timing, aligning their creation with specific astrological conditions. Each tool is inscribed with symbols and names of power, believed to imbue the items with the ability to control or direct spirits. The careful attention to these tools highlights the grimoire's systematic approach to magic. The rituals described in the Greater Key of Solomon often involve invoking divine names and commanding spirits to perform tasks or share knowledge. The practitioner is portrayed as a figure who, through purity and faith, has the authority to wield power over these entities. This perspective aligns with the medieval Christian worldview, where divine authority superseded all other powers. Despite being attributed to King Solomon, there is no historical evidence connecting him to the text. Solomon's biblical reputation as a wise king with command over spirits likely inspired the association. In Jewish folklore, Solomon is credited with controlling demons to build the temple in Jerusalem, a narrative that influenced later Christian magical traditions. By attributing the grimoire to Solomon, the authors lent it an air of authority and mystique. The text has survived in various manuscripts and translations. One of the most influential modern versions was translated by MacGregor Mathers, a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, in the late 19th century. Today, the text remains a key resource for ceremonial magicians and occult enthusiasts. The story of Pope Joan is one of the medieval world's most fascinating mysteries. It tells of a woman who allegedly disguised herself as a man, climbed the ranks of the church, and briefly reigned as pope, until a dramatic gender reveal ended her life. The tale of the first and only female pope first surfaced in the chronicles of the 13th century and spread widely across Europe, and even gained official church recognition for a time. History says every pope was a man. Now let's explore if the truth says otherwise. The earliest known account appears in a Latin chronicle by Jean de Mailly, a Dominican friar writing around 1250. His Chronicle of Metz contains the first mention of an unnamed woman pope, though he sets her story in the year 1099 and doesn't give her a name. According to his brief report, a talented woman concealed her gender and became a curial secretary, then a cardinal, and finally, pope. The deception was revealed when she went into labor and gave birth during a public procession. In this telling, the consequences were dire. She was tied to a horse's tail and dragged through the streets of Rome, before being stoned and then buried. Jean de Mailly even added that a fast was instituted in memory of this event and her punishment. This initial version is brutal and cautionary, reading like a morality tale of the results of deception unveiled, rather than an actual historical account. Later in the 13th century, another Dominican chronicler, Martin of Troppau, included an expanded version of the female pope story in a popular compendium of papal and imperial histories. Martin's Chronicon Pontificum et Imperatorum became one of the most widely read chronicles of the later Middle Ages, and its account of the female pope was especially influential. In Martin's version, new details appeared that set the template for the legend. The woman pope was given an identity, John Anglicus of Mainz, implying an Englishwoman born in Mainz, Germany. Martin placed her in the 9th century after the pontificate of Pope Leo IV, who died in 855. He wrote that after Leo, an Englishwoman who hailed from Germany, who went by John Anglicus, occupied the papal throne for over 2 years. Martin's narrative fleshes out her backstory. She was an exceedingly intelligent young woman who wanted to pursue further education. The only problem was, educational opportunities for her were extremely limited, so her and her lover cooked up a plan. They would go to Athens to further her education, but they would present themselves as two men seeking further knowledge in this ancient center of learning. While in Athens, she quickly proved to be far superior to her peers intellectually, and was brought to Rome where she taught science and theology. Her intellectual capacity and moral character were so universally respected that she was eventually chosen as pope. However, things ended up going off the rails in a very big way. She became pregnant, and the inevitable happened during a papal procession between St. Peter's and the Lateran Basilica. Caught in a grand religious procession, the disguised pope went into labor and delivered a child in the street, in full view of the astonished populace. Martin's chronicle says she perished during childbirth, not as a result of an angry crowd, and notes that after that, future popes avoided passing that particular spot in processions. This female pope, according to this telling, was then rapidly buried where she perished, and the baby became a ward of the church. Interestingly, according to this account, her son later became the Bishop of Ostia, in Italy, and saw to her receiving a proper burial. It's with Martin's account that the name Joan or Joanna entered the legend. Martin's authority on historical matters was taken very seriously by contemporaries. He was a papal chaplain, and his chronicle was read widely as factual history. Further, the sensational nature of the anecdote meant that the tale of Pope Joan spread rapidly, as the idea of a pregnant pope is a story that's built to rapidly spread. Once inserted into popular chronicles and literature, the story of Pope Joan spread throughout Europe, capturing the medieval imagination. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the legend was often accepted as historical fact. Many people didn't doubt that a woman had once been pope. It was retold by preachers, included in encyclopedic works, and referenced by scholars of the time. For example, the Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio in 1363 wrote about the female pontiff, giving her a place among notable women of history, albeit as a cautionary tale of pride. A woodcut illustration from a 1474 printed edition of Boccaccio's work even depicts Pope Joan in the very moment of giving birth, baby in arms, wearing the papal tiara. This vivid image shows how concretely the story was imagined in late medieval culture. Some historians also speculate that the High Priestess card for 15th century tarot decks is a reference to Pope Joan, though this can't be confirmed with certainty. Medieval commentators casually invoked Pope Joan as a real person. Notably, the Czech reformer Jan Hus, during his trial for heresy at the Council of Constance in 1415, referred to the example of a female pope to challenge church authority. Despite this being a heresy trial, no one on the council pushed back and argued that she was mythical. The fact that even loyal churchmen during a heresy trial didn't publicly object to Huss's mention indicates that the historicity of Pope Joan was accepted. Serious doubts about the Pope Joan narrative only began to surface after hundreds of years of uncritical repetition. As Renaissance humanism encouraged a return to original sources and a more critical look at history, some scholars started to question the entire narrative. The big giveaway that diminished the plausibility of a female pope turned out to be the fact that her story wasn't recorded at all in contemporaneous records. One early skeptic was Vatican librarian Bartolomeo Platina, who compiled Lives of the Popes in 1479. He included Joan in his list of popes, but ultimately concluded the story wasn't credible given the chronological impossibilities, rather than the underlying story itself. In essence, the time period where she was said to have been pope had been clearly accounted for. It was really in the 16th century, however, that Pope Joan became the subject of fierce debate. The timing is no coincidence. This was the era of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. The legend was dragged into confessional conflicts. Protestant writers often seized upon Pope Joan as a handy example of Catholic corruption or error, delighting in the embarrassment the story caused for Rome. At the same time, Catholic scholars worked to refute the tale and defend the unbroken maleness of the papacy. According to the Counter-Reformation scholars, the chronology was airtight. Leo IV died in July 855, and Benedict III was elected in the same year and confirmed by September. According to this narrative, records like Benedict's charter of October 855 and correspondence from that year all exist, so there's no space where an unrecorded Pope Joan could fit. That said, many Protestant scholars suggested that records of Pope Joan had been destroyed, and the records cited were forgeries to maintain the integrity of the Church. After all, the Church didn't have an official problem with the historical reality of Pope Joan as late as the 15th century. Only when Protestantism became an existential crisis for the Church did Joan become a real issue. All that said, by the 18th century, most historians had come to agree that Pope Joan likely never existed, even putting aside the possibility of forgeries, and there's good reasons for this. Today, historians largely consider Pope Joan a legendary figure rather than a real one, and the story is studied as an example of how medieval legends can emerge and evolve. No contemporaneous medieval document whatsoever corroborates the existence of a female pope in the 800s or at any other time. Not a single chronicle, letter, or record from the supposed era of Joan mentions such an astonishing event, a fact which would be virtually impossible if it had truly occurred. Further, even the fiercest enemies of the papacy in earlier eras never mention a female pope, though it would have been the perfect ammunition to attack Rome. There are no records of Eastern Orthodox sources mentioning Pope Joan after the Great Schism, a fact that historians believe would have been mentioned. Likewise, there are no records to indicate proto-Protestant groups like the Cathars and the Waldensians made any mentions of a female pope. Further yet, despite having clashed with the Islamic world extensively during this period, there are no Muslim sources discussing a woman leading the Catholic Church. In essence, the silence of all sources until the 13th century is the ultimate red flag that Joan was not a real historical person. Even after rigorous historical analysis has debunked Pope Joan, her story has proven remarkably enduring, and there are a few reasons for this. Most importantly, the tale is simply too sensational and intriguing to forget. It's the story of a secret female pope who rises to the position through her sheer brilliance, followed by a shocking revelation and downfall. These are elements of high drama that appeal to human curiosity. In terms of storytelling, it hits the marks of a classic folktale or legend, which helped it spread by word of mouth and point of pen alike. The story served both symbolic and educational purposes for a wide variety of audiences, all of whom could interpret it in a way that suited them. In the Middle Ages, it could be read as a moral lesson about deception, or even as a comment on the state of the church. Still, another interpretation that has kept the story alive in modern times is who Pope Joan was supposed to be. According to the most popular telling of the tale, she was much more brilliant than any of her male counterparts, and achieved the position of Pope entirely on her merits. In this way, her story could be reinterpreted as a tale of both empowerment and oppression in a much less enlightened time.